According to statistical data, in 1989, the total displacement of all ships in the Soviet Navy exceeded the displacement of the American Navy by 17%. Of course, evaluating the power of a navy by its total displacement is highly inaccurate. There was also a considerable amount of outdated equipment in the domestic navy. Escort ships built in the early 60s, post-war destroyers of Project 56, old missile cruisers, artillery cruisers dating back to the 50s, and Project 254 minesweepers, the most common type of minesweeper in the world, were built from 1948 through the 60s. Ships from the measurement complex, Sibir, Sakhalin, Chukotka, former ore carriers built in 58, diesel submarines from the 60s, first-generation nuclear submarines, and so on. A similar situation was observed in the American fleet, and in addition to the natural service life of the ships running out and resources being depleted, the problem of the arms race was also becoming more acute. Maintaining such a huge fleet required a massive amount of material resources. The only clear explanation for the phenomenon of operating hundreds of useless ships is the bloating of staff and, as a result, the increase in the number of admiral positions. It's not hard to guess that many of these ships were barely operational and were being prepared for scrapping, regardless of the political or economic situation in the country. On July 31, 1991, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the United States of America signed the Treaty on the Reduction and Limitation of Strategic Offensive Arms, abbreviated as Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, FERFID. This document put a final end to the Cold War. The treaty was signed by Presidents George Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev in Moscow on the eve of the August coup, and was later ratified by the Russian parliament. The treaty entered into force on December 5, 1994, when Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine joined it, having given up the strategic missiles and nuclear weapons that were located on their territory during the Soviet Union era. According to many experts, the significance of Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty lies in recognizing the fact that the security of each of the contracting parties directly depends on its strategic partner. Thus, the United States was forced to agree that Moscow, with its missile and nuclear potential, poses a significant threat to them. As a result, together with the Russian Federation, they undertook a radical reduction of their armed potential in order to reduce this threat and lessen the pressure of the missile-nuclear shield on their economy. Moreover, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty 1 agreements became the largest voluntary disarmament of a fleet in history. Thousands of ships were sent to the scrapyard, from auxiliary repair vessels to nuclear submarines. Among the scrapped ships, there were many interesting examples that were either permanently turned into scrap metal, used as targets during exercises, or sent to third world countries. Let's take a look at how this happened. By the year 2001, a total of 261 nuclear submarines had been built in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and Russia, more than half of the world's submarine fleet. Most of these were second-generation vessels with conventional armament. During the Cold War, the arms race greatly influenced submarine development. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics invested heavily in this field. Daniil Moskovsky became the first submarine to surface under the Arctic ice. The Union developed the most durable titanium hulls through Project 945. They were also the first to create the deepest diving nuclear submarine, Komsomolets, and they were the first to launch intercontinental ballistic missiles from under the ice cap with Typhoon. The main thing the Soviets always lagged behind the Americans in was low noise. But even on noisy submarines, incidents sometimes happened. When a sailor on the nuclear submarine Tambov fell ill, the doctor, incapable of performing the operation, requested permission to surface. Tambov surfaced from the depths of the sea right in the middle of a NATO exercise. A scandal broke out in the United Kingdom, after which the Minister of Defense resigned. No less of a stir was caused by the autonomous voyage of the sadly famous submarine Kursk. In 1999, it passed unnoticed through the entire Mediterranean Sea. To reduce the noise, the sailors turned off the cooling system. At the same time, by the 90s, the world faced a new problem. spent nuclear fuel. By that time, the fleet was in urgent need of reorganization. New, modern submarines were required, and the old ones had to be disposed of. Over these 30-plus years, progress in shipbuilding has advanced significantly. For example, in early March 2020, the United States Navy announced the creation of such an ambitious project, a submarine controlled by artificial intelligence, capable of attacking without orders from military personnel. The project is under the jurisdiction of the Naval Research Directorate and was described as the Autonomous Underwater Weapons System, KLOZ. It is expected that the KLOZ system will be installed on new robotic submarines of the Orca class, which have 12 torpedo tubes and are being developed for the Navy by Boeing. Autonomous submarines with artificial intelligence already exist and can perform tasks without human involvement. However, they are not very smart and still have limited functionality. The problem of disposing of nuclear submarines has arisen everywhere. The Americans decided that it was more cost-effective to destroy the submarines than to keep them in service. In Russia, however, submarines were decommissioned, but continued to be used. Decommissioned submarines were abandoned in shallow waters, where they often sank, sometimes together with their nuclear reactors. For example, in Krasheninnikov Bay, 9 nuclear submarines stood in the middle of the bay for many years. They were deliberately run aground so that they wouldn't sink completely. All of them still had their nuclear fuel on board. To this day, no country has figured out what to do with spent nuclear fuel. As of today, nuclear waste is stored on land. Because the largest number of such submarines were in Russia, most of this waste ended up on Russian territory. It was at that time, in the 90s, that the United States offered help. But the United States agreed to help only on one condition. In exchange, the strategic missile submarines with intercontinental ballistic missiles had to be destroyed. The Cooperative Threat Reduction Program was developed by the United States in 1991. It became known as the Nunn-Lugar Program, named after Senators Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar. The main focus of the program is the disposal of strategic nuclear weapons, transportation of nuclear waste, and destruction of chemical weapons. Part of the program was genuinely positive in nature. A nuclear storage facility was built on the Kola Peninsula. Order was established in the transportation of nuclear waste to the Chelyabinsk Mayak, the largest Russian center for processing radioactive materials. But at the same time, Western countries insisted on carrying out the main part of their program, the destruction of nuclear warheads and strategic missile submarines. It is known that each nuclear submarine has 2 nuclear reactors. Therefore, each of them could become a new Chernobyl. The so-called reserve submarines are the most secret part of the Navy's activities. The reserve nuclear submarines have become the biggest headache for the commanders of coastal bases, not only because they need to be kept afloat, but also because they sink during transportation to the dismantling site, as happened, for example, with K1 159. The reason is simple. The completely rusted submarine was not prepared for the transfer. Combat nuclear submarines were frequently repaired at their own expense. Fleet modernization also impacted coastal bases. Repairs. All the small factories and floating docks that carried out minor repairs between missions were destroyed at once. Only during 1997, 1999, 213 auxiliary and support vessels, as well as 35 ships and submarines, were withdrawn from the Navy. As a result, the crews themselves had to repair the nuclear engines. For example, on Danil Moskovsky, the main crew had to buy spare parts at their own expense, which were missing after the vessel had been operated by the second crew. And the crew of the nuclear submarine Omsk fixed the problems during the submarine's repairs on their own. Who knows what the cost of this repair is? According to experts, 55% of all submarine accidents occurred due to crew error. Many nuclear submarines were scrapped. For example, the Soviet submarines of Project 671 Yorsh, which were built on the principle of being cheap and simple. Nevertheless, for a long time, they remained almost the backbone of Soviet naval power. The low cost and speed of these submarines were indeed major advantages of the 671 Sais. Each one cost about 50 million Soviet rubles and was built in 8 to 9 months. At the same time, the Yursh-class submarines were fast, maneuverable, and well-armed. At the time, it was thanks to the Project KID-627A nuclear submarines that the Soviet Union was able to establish itself on the world stage as the second country in the world. Possessing a developed nuclear submarine fleet for their time, the 627A class truly had outstanding characteristics both in terms of armament and performance. The Project 941. Akula nuclear submarines are the largest submarines in the world. During the Cold War, these heavy strategic missile cruisers were the main trump card of the Soviet nuclear forces. Each Akula carried 20 ballistic missiles on board. A total of 6 such giants were built in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. At the moment, half of them have already been decommissioned and scrapped. The other half no longer go out to sea and are quietly awaiting their fate. The scrapping of one of the ships, TK-200, was even financed by the Americans in 2005. An equally dramatic story unfolded around the cruisers. For example, the cruisers of Project 68B. These ships were the last series of Soviet purely artillery cruisers, whose main armament consisted of 12 152 mm guns. In addition, the cruiser was equipped with 6 twin 100mm anti-aircraft guns, 2 torpedo tubes, and mines. This series of cruisers was one of the largest in the world, and the cruisers themselves remained the main surface combat ships of the Soviet Navy up until the mid-1960s. This is the cruiser Admiral Lazarev of Project 68. BIS was decommissioned and sold for scrap to India in 1991. And this is Alexander Suvorov, who met the same fate. By the way, like most cruisers of this type, the Soviet Project 956 Sarich-class destroyers actively served in various seas. Among other things, with their help, the Soviet Union demonstrated a confident presence in the world ocean to the entire world. In critical situations of the Cold War, the Project 956 ships repeatedly approached various shores as a demonstration and a strong hint at delicate circumstances. The history of destroyers also came to an end in the 90s. One of the last, Ochayani, was decommissioned in 2007. Formally, the last one, Gremyashchi, remains afloat. However, it hasn't gone to sea since 1997. Among the severe losses of the Russian Navy in the 1990s, it is definitely worth mentioning the large reconnaissance ship subsurface vessel Tridzat Tri-Ural and the measurement complex ship Marshal Nedelin. Unique ocean reconnaissance ships, packed to the limit with the most precise electronics, radars, and space communication systems. Marshal Nedelin served only 7 years, but during its short life accomplished quite a few useful tasks. It conducted telemetry measurements during test launches of intercontinental ballistic missiles, established communication with spacecraft, participated in the rescue of the Salyut, 7 orbital station, and even boldly filmed the American naval base Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. In 1991, the ship docked at the factory wall for scheduled major repairs, from which it never returned. The ship's electronic equipment was taken apart and sold to scrap metal collection points, and Marshal Nedelin was soon sent for dismantling in India. Regarding the dismantling in India, this is the Shore of the Dead. That's the resonant nickname given to the coastline near the town of Alang in India. Alang has become the largest shipbreaking yard in the world. The Alang coastline is divided into 400 dismantling sites, known locally as platforms. At any moment, 20,000 to 40,000 workers are employed there, manually breaking down ships. On average, about 300 workers are assigned to each ship, and within 2 months, the ship is completely dismantled for scrap metal. Each year, about 1,500 ships of almost every imaginable class and type are dismantled, from warships to supertankers, from container ships to research vessels. The coast of Langa is perfectly suited for this kind of work and this method. The thing is, a truly high tide happens only twice a month, and it is during this time that ships are often run aground under their own power. Then, the water recedes, and the ships end up completely on the shore. And thanks to India's warning service, the marine typhoons and tsunamis that periodically hit the coast do not cause any harm. Work on dismantling the ships is suspended during this period, and all equipment is moved to the shore or into the ship's superstructures, which are inaccessible to the oncoming waves. The dismantling of ships is impressive in its thoroughness. First, absolutely everything that can be removed and separated is taken off, as something individual and suitable for further use. Doors and locks, engine parts, beds, mattresses, galley appliances, and life jackets. Then, piece by piece, the entire hull is cut apart. The main workforce of Alang is the poorest segment of the population, both from the state of Gujarat and from other states of India. They are happy earning a couple of dollars a day. According to the Gujarat Maritime Administration, since the beginning of the shipbreaking business in Alang in 1982, 382 workers have died. The workers and their families live in shacks made from scrap without water or electricity. There is no medical care, and the rate of injuries is horrifying. Doctors in Alang say that they treat 100 or more injured people every week, many of them with lung injuries caused by inhaling all kinds of toxic substances. The technological process for recycling is as follows. The ships are brought under their own power to a designated section of the shore, bow facing the land, during the few hours of high tide. Within 7 to 10 days after the tide recedes, dismantling of equipment is underway. Non-ferrous metals are being cut out from pipelines. Copper cables and power chains are being dismantled. After that, the actual dismantling begins. Construction scaffolding is pulled up to the side of the vessel on sleds, from which gas cutters make vertical cuts to divide the hull into sections so that each section contains a compartment, limited by transverse bulkheads that maintains buoyancy. The bottom is cut from the inside. During the next high tide, the sections are slowly pulled toward the shore with winches and moved apart from each other, expanding the work front. Each section is cut and broken down into large blocks separately, starting from the top at the double bottom. The blocks are pulled ashore for final cutting into oversized scrap. A minimum of equipment is used for all operations. Dangerous concentrations of easily flammable gases can accumulate in the ship's fuel tanks and other compartments, and proper degassing is often neglected in the pursuit of cost savings. When cutting with torches, this mixture can explode. When ships are dismantled using such makeshift methods, major disasters can occur. For example, on November 1, 2016 in Gadani, Pakistan, an explosion happened during the dismantling of an oil tanker. As a result of the explosion and the subsequent fire, at least 19 people died, and another 59 suffered burns of varying severity. The environmental damage from ship dismantling is not so obvious in everyday life, but it is no less severe because of that. Naturally, in situations where even human health is neglected, no one thinks about the environment at all. According to the rules established by the Special Basel Convention, all hazardous substances obtained during ship dismantling must be sorted on site, stored in specially designated places, and properly disposed of. In fact, the most convenient place to get rid of them turned out to be the nearby Indian Ocean. The coastal waters and, in fact, the dismantling beaches represent a zone of ecological disaster, the fate of which nobody cares about. But let's get back to the dismantling of the Soviet fleet. Subsurface Vessel 33, Ural, a stillborn project of a large reconnaissance ship, Project 1941, with a nuclear power plant. With a full displacement of 36,000 tons, it was the largest reconnaissance ship in history. Time showed that Ural was pure utopia, a dubious project without any real purpose or meaning. In theory, everything looked perfect. The gigantic nuclear ship could cruise along the United States coast for months, recording all interesting radio communications on any frequencies, or, on the contrary, patrol near American missile test sites, studying the behavior of separating warheads of ICBMs at the final stage of their trajectory. In practice, everything turned out to be much more complicated. Like everything that is too big, Ural turned out to be unviable, too expensive, complex, and unreliable. The supership never made it to the American missile range on Kwajalein Atoll. After 2 fires and a number of serious problems with the nuclear installation and the fragile electronics, Ural was laid up in Strelok Bay. As it turned out, forever. An interesting fate befell the heavy aircraft-carrying cruiser Minsk. It was laid down in 1972. 3 years later, it was launched, and it officially joined the Navy 15 years after that. A lack of funds forced the command to decommission the ship and then sell it for scrap to the South Korean company Yang Distribution Corp., reportedly for a mere $4.5 million. The ship stayed in South Korea for a short time and was then resold to a Chinese company. But this company soon went bankrupt, and the ship became part of a military park in Shenzhen. That's where it still stands today, attracting Chinese tourists. There are even souvenir shops on the Minsk, where they sell manicure sets, matryoshka dolls, and playing cards. That same arms reduction treaty, of course, also affected the States. The first thing they did there was scrap the nuclear cruisers. Sailors had long been frustrated by their excessive cost and constant concerns about their radiation safety. At the same time, the nuclear-powered ships had no real advantages, except for their pointless unlimited autonomy in terms of fuel supply. Long Beach, Bainbridge, and Truxtun were sent for disposal without regret. The same fate awaited the more modern California and South Carolina. Despite what seemed to be a normal age of 20 to 25 years, their combat capabilities had become completely obsolete by the early 90s. But it was most upsetting to part with the Virginias. 4 fantastic constructions with nuclear reactors and powerful weaponry, capable of circling the globe 7 times without stopping and striking the enemy with Tomahawk missiles and long-range anti-aircraft missiles at any point in the world. Moreover, all the cruisers were supposed to have a long service life ahead of them. Texas was only 15, and Mississippi had just turned 19 years old. At the same time, the cruiser's service life was calculated to be 35 years, until 2015. After scrapping their nuclear cruisers, the Americans were not satisfied. 18 escort cruisers of the Legge and Belknap classes, 46 Knox-class anti-submarine frigates, all of them were sent to the scrapyard. Some frigates were lucky. They were sold to foreign navies, where they are still in service to this day. The rest ended up on the ocean floor with holes in their hulls, were shot up during exercises, or were simply dismantled for scrap in the docks. With somber eyes, the sailors watched the last of the great heavyweights depart. Within a short period, 7 aircraft carriers left the ranks of the United States Navy. Of these, 6 were old ships of the Midway and Forrestal classes, and 1 was a relatively new aircraft carrier, America. At the time of decommissioning, America was only 30 years old. That's nothing by aircraft carrier standards, as they usually serve for half a century. The reason for the remarkable longevity of aircraft carriers is simple. Their main and only weapon is their air wing. It is independently updated every 10 to 15 years without any changes to the ship's design itself. Generations of fighters and bombers change, but the carrier platform itself remains the same. The aircraft carrier rusted in a scrapyard for 9 years, and finally, in 2005, a decision was made to sink it. Despite numerous protests against such disposal of a ship bearing the nation's name, the America was taken out to sea with its holds full of explosives and sent to the scrapyard of history. After decommissioning 117 ships, nuclear missile cruisers, frigates, destroyers, battleships, and aircraft carriers, the Americans were still not satisfied. The fate that befell Soviet destroyers also caught up with the American ones, specifically as many as 35 destroyers. Along with the special series of the United States Navy Spruance class in the 1990s, another 15 modern Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigates also left the fleet. Some of them were sold to Turkey and Egypt, while others were scrapped for metal. No less significant changes occurred in the American submarine fleet. 11 Los Angeles-class multipurpose nuclear submarines, known in Russian as LOS, were decommissioned. All of them are new. Most of them were only 15 years old when dismantled. Americans classify the Los Angeles as a class. Submarine hunters. The main tasks of the LOSI are to cover aircraft carrier groups and deployment areas of strategic missile submarines, as well as to combat enemy submarines. LOSI are known for their reliability and low self-noise levels. They are highly maneuverable, have modest dimensions, and are heavily armed, including 12 Magavake missiles. The nuclear-powered Los Angeles-class submarines remain the core of the United States Navy's submarine fleet. Along with 11 new submarines, the sailors also got rid of their predecessors. 37 multipurpose Stengen-class nuclear submarines were built in the early 70s, and 12 Benjamin Franklin-class strategic missile submarines were also withdrawn from active service. Since the beginning of the disposal of its own fleet in the 90s, the United States Navy has lost 227 warships, both large and small, obsolete and still quite modern. That very Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, I-Treaty, ended in 2009. Even before the expiration of the first treaty, Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty 2 was signed in 2002, and in 2010, Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty 2E as well. But the next two treaties mainly concerned nuclear weapons, and intercontinental ballistic missiles. And there has never been such a massive reduction of the fleet. By the way, we discussed nuclear submarines and nuclear energy and technologies in detail in a big video. Check it out if you're into nuclear topics. See you in upcoming videos on our channel.